The parking garage beneath Voss Dynamics smelled of concrete and cold coffee, and Marcus Reed stood perfectly still while a young security guard tore through the trunk of his old sedan like he was searching for contraband. A cluster of junior executives slowed their walk to watch, one of them laughing under his breath. "This is who they hired to drive the CEO," the guard said, not bothering to lower his voice. Marcus said nothing. His hand tightened, just slightly, around the strap of a worn canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Inside it, wrapped in a folded shirt, was a medal he had not looked at in 3 years. Across the garage, Elena Voss walked past without breaking stride, her eyes flicking toward him for exactly 1 second, filled with something between indifference and disdain, before she disappeared through the elevator doors. No one in that garage knew that the man they had just humiliated was the only person who had ever brought his entire team home alive. What secret was folded inside that old jacket pocket? Marcus Reed's mornings ran with the precision of a man who had once depended on precision to survive. By 5:40, he was already in the kitchen of his small rented house on the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, cracking eggs into a pan while his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, sat at the table finishing a math worksheet she had put off the night before. He never rushed her. He never raised his voice. He simply moved through the house with the quiet economy of someone who had learned, long ago, that wasted motion could cost a life. 2 years earlier, Sophie's mother had died after a long illness, and in the wreckage of that loss, Marcus had folded himself entirely into the role of father. He drove Sophie to school every morning, checked the lock on the front door twice without thinking about it, and scanned the street before backing out of the driveway, a habit from another life he had never managed to shed. The job he had left behind, the one that had given him the medal in the canvas bag, was something he almost never spoke of, not to neighbors, not to the school counselor, not even to Sophie, who only knew that her father had once been a soldier, and that soldiers didn't like to talk about the past. Their house was small, but it was theirs in every way that mattered. The porch light had a habit of flickering that Marcus kept meaning to fix. A row of Sophie's school photographs lined the hallway, each one marking a year he had gotten her through on his own. He had built a life out of small, dependable rituals: pancakes on Sundays, a walk around the block before bed, the same 3 songs played low on the radio during the drive to school. Because rituals, he had learned, were what kept a person steady when everything else had once fallen apart in an instant. The private driver position at Voss Dynamics had come through a staffing agency, one line in a stack of listings that promised steady hours and reliable pay. Marcus needed both. He needed a schedule flexible enough to get Sophie to school and back, and he needed the kind of income that didn't disappear the way freelance security consulting sometimes did. He said nothing on his application about the years he had spent leading a specialized unit overseas. It's nothing about the operation that had ended his career and taken the life of the man who had been closer to him than a brother. On paper, he was simply Marcus Reed, 41, honorably discharged, available immediately. That morning, before he left for his first day, Sophie tugged at his sleeve in the doorway. "What if they're mean to you again? Like the last place?" Her voice carried the particular worry of a child who had already watched her father absorb more than his share of quiet disrespect. Marcus knelt down to her eye level and told her, in the calm, even voice she had grown up trusting completely, that it would be fine, that some people needed time to see clearly. He didn't tell her about the box on top of the hallway closet, the one he had looked at for a long moment that morning before deciding, once again, not to open it. He kissed the top of her head instead, told her to grab her backpack, and let the moment pass the way he let most difficult moments pass, quietly, without ceremony, forward motion the only answer he trusted. Voss Dynamics occupied 30 floors of glass and steel in uptown Charlotte, a security and logistics technology company that had grown, in less than a decade, from a modest startup into one of the most closely watched firms in the industry. At the center of it stood Elena Voss, 33 years old, who had inherited controlling interest in the company at 29 after her father's sudden death, and had spent every day since proving to a board of much older men that she belonged in the chair she now occupied. Elena's world was one of constant scrutiny. Every decision she made was measured against the ghost of her father's reputation. Every hesitation read as weakness by board members who had never quite accepted a woman that young running a company that large. She had learned to move through boardrooms with a controlled, almost armored composure, giving away nothing, trusting almost no one, completely a habit reinforced, more than she consciously realized, by Richard Kane. Kane had served as chief operating officer since before Elena's father passed, and in the years since, he had positioned himself as her closest advisor and the steady hand guiding her through decisions she was too new to fully understand. Or, so he framed it. He offered opinions freely and often, subtly shaping which employees she trusted and which she kept at arm's length. He had a way of speaking that made his suggestions feel like her own conclusions, arriving late in a conversation with a single sentence that reframed everything she had just decided. It was a skill she had never quite noticed him using, because it worked exactly as intended. What Elena did not know was that behind his office door, late in the evenings, Kane's voice changed, entirely clipped, urgent, speaking in the careful language of a man discussing something he needed no one else to hear. The company was in the final stretch of securing a massive government security contract, one that would define its next decade, and Kane had quietly begun feeding sensitive details of that bid to a rival firm overseas, positioning himself for a payout that had nothing to do with loyalty. He told himself, in the small hours when guilt tried to surface, that he had built this company as much as anyone, that he deserved a future no board vote could take from him. None of this touched Marcus during his first days behind the wheel of Elena's car. He drove her to meetings, waited in silence in parking structures and hotel valet lines, and said almost nothing beyond what courtesy required. He noticed everything, the exits of every building she entered, the vehicles that lingered too long near the curb, the small tells in Kane's posture whenever a call ended abruptly, but he filed it all away without comment, the same way he once logged terrain and movement in another life, a habit that never fully switched off. He had learned, long before this job, that the world revealed itself to people who stayed quiet long enough to actually watch it. At night, after Sophie was asleep, Marcus sometimes sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, going over the small details of the day the way another man might review a to-do list, the pattern of Kane's phone calls, the odd hesitation in a colleague's voice, the timing of certain meetings that seemed to shift without explanation. He told himself it was nothing more than old habit, the residue of a career that had trained him never to let his guard down completely. He didn't yet know that the habit would matter more than he expected. Elena barely registered him those first 2 weeks. To her, he was simply another line item in a long list of staff she rarely thought about, punctual, silent, unremarkable in every way that mattered to a woman managing a billion-dollar company, balanced on the edge of the biggest deal of her career. If she noticed anything about him at all, it was only that he seemed to fade into the background more completely than any driver she'd employed before, a quality she found convenient and gave no further thought to. The company itself ran on a rhythm few outsiders ever saw. Behind the glass walls and the polished lobby, teams worked around the clock refining the security software that had made Voss Dynamics a name, whispered with respect in government circles, encryption systems, surveillance architecture, protocols meant to keep entire cities safe from threats most people never had to think about. It was work Elena's father had started in a converted garage 2 decades earlier, work she had inherited, along with the weight of proving she could carry it forward without him. Board meetings often felt less like strategy sessions, and more like quiet interrogations. Older men in tailored suits testing her at every turn, waiting for the moment she would prove them right about a young woman running a company built by someone else. The public event was held on the 40th floor of a downtown hotel, a launch celebration for the partnership Voss Dynamics hoped would carry the government contract across the finish line. The ballroom had been arranged with careful precision banners bearing the company's name, rows of round tables set for the partners and dignitaries Elena had spent months courting, a stage where she was scheduled to speak in less than an hour. Traffic that evening had collapsed without warning, a jackknife truck 3 lanes deep on the interstate, and no amount of careful driving could undo 20 minutes lost to gridlock. When Marcus finally pulled up to the entrance, Elena was already out of patience, and the ballroom doors behind her were filled with the very partners and board members she had spent months trying to impress. She turned on him in front of all of them. Her voice, usually so controlled, cracked with a fury that silenced the small crowd near the entrance. She called him careless, She called him a liability the company couldn't afford. She told him, loudly enough for the valet staff and 2 board members to hear clearly, that he was one mistake away from unemployment, and that perhaps he had never been suited for this kind of responsibility in the first place. The words landed hard, sharper than she probably intended, but she didn't take any of them back. She was thinking about the room behind her, about the contract, about every man in that ballroom waiting to see if tonight would be the night she finally stumbled. Marcus was, in that moment, simply the nearest place to put the pressure that had been building in her for weeks. A handful of guests near the entrance had stopped to watch, phones lowered but not put away, the kind of moment that could easily have ended up circulating online by morning. One of the younger executives actually smiled. The same smile Marcus had seen in the parking garage weeks earlier, the smile of someone enjoying another person's smallness because it made their own position feel a little more secure. Kane stood near the doorway through all of it, watching Elena's outburst with quiet satisfaction, saying nothing, doing nothing to diffuse it, content to let the moment do exactly what he hoped it would do to the driver he had never trusted. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't explain the truck, the closed lanes, the 20 minutes that had been entirely outside his control. He simply lowered his eyes, said he understood, and stepped back to hold the door, but something in the stillness of his posture, the total absence of panic or defensiveness, made the nearest security guard pause mid-conversation and actually look at him. It was not the reaction of a man who had just been humiliated. It was the reaction of a man scanning a room, cataloging exits, counting heads, the way soldiers do without ever deciding to. He held the door until every guest had passed, closed it behind the last of them, and walked back to the car alone, the cold evening air doing nothing to loosen the tightness in his jaw. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, hands resting on his knees, breathing slow, and even the way he had once taught younger soldiers to steady themselves before anything difficult. He thought about calling it quits, about how easy it would be to walk away from a job that clearly didn't want him there. Then he thought about Sophie's tuition for the after-school program, about the mortgage payment due in 10 days, and about the quiet dignity of simply doing the job well, regardless of who noticed. He started the car and drove home, saying nothing about any of it when Sophie asked how his day had gone. The days that followed carried a tension neither of them spoke aloud. On a routine drive back from a supplier meeting, Marcus caught it in the mirror before Elena ever noticed anything wrong. A gray sedan holding the same distance through 3 consecutive turns, too patient to be coincidence. He didn't alarm her. He simply changed the route, took 2 turns that made no logical sense for their destination, and watched the sedan fall away behind them at a red light, gone as quietly as it had appeared. Elena, scrolling through emails in the back seat, only looked up when she realized they'd taken a different way entirely. "Why did we go this way?" she asked, more curious than concerned. "Construction," Marcus said, which wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth either. She studied him in the rearview mirror longer than the answer warranted. There was something in the way he drove too smooth, too aware, the kind of defensive maneuvering she had seen once in a security briefing years earlier and never expected to witness from a man hired to carry her briefcase between meetings. She asked him, almost testing him, where he'd learned to drive like that. He met her eyes in the mirror for a beat before answering. "I've driven in worse conditions than Charlotte traffic," he said, and offered nothing further. It should have reassured her. Instead, it left her with more questions than she'd started with. A small, unresolved thread she found herself tugging at in quiet moments over the following days during meetings when her attention wandered, during the elevator ride down at the end of a long day, in the seconds before sleep when her mind refused to settle on anything simpler. There was a rhythm to the way Marcus checked his mirrors, a rhythm that had nothing to do with ordinary caution. Elena began noticing it the way a person notices a familiar tune played slightly out of key, the extra half-second he spent scanning intersections, the way he never took the same route twice in the same week without a reason, the way his eyes moved to rooftops and parked vehicles other drivers never seemed to register at all. She said nothing about it, filing each small observation away the same way he filed away hers, both of them circling something neither was ready to name. One afternoon, waiting for her outside a downtown law office, Marcus watched a delivery van circle the block twice, its driver never once glancing toward the loading entrance he was supposedly heading for. He memorized the plate without thinking, the way another man might glance at the time, and thought nothing more of it until the same van appeared again 3 days later, parked half a block from Voss Dynamics, with its engine idling far longer than any delivery required. The highway curved along the outskirts of the city on a gray Thursday evening, 3 lanes of steady traffic carrying commuters home, when the 18-wheeler in the lane beside them began drifting without signaling, closing the gap far too quickly to be an accident. Marcus felt it before he consciously registered it, a wrongness in the truck's angle, the absence of brake lights, the deliberate patience of a vehicle that wasn't drifting but hunting. He didn't hesitate. In the space of 2 seconds, he dropped speed, cut the wheel with a precision that defied the size of the car, and threaded them through a gap in traffic that shouldn't have existed, the truck's trailer clipping empty air where their bumper had been a heartbeat earlier. Elena's scream caught in her throat and never fully escaped. Her hands gripped the seat, knuckles white, her whole body braced for an impact that never came. When the car finally leveled out on the shoulder, engine still running, hazards ticking, she found herself staring at a man whose hands hadn't shaken once, whose breathing had barely changed, whose eyes were already scanning the mirrors for a second threat that never came. It was the stillness that frightened her more than the near collision itself. She had just watched someone save her life without a single wasted movement, and some part of her understood, even then, that this was not the first time he had done something like it. Behind them, the 18-wheeler continued down the highway as though nothing had happened, its taillights shrinking into the evening traffic before either of them could catch a plate number. Other drivers slowed briefly to look, a few pulling over to ask if they were all right, and Marcus answered each one with the same calm, measured voice, waving them on, already running through the sequence of what needed to happen next. Pull the dashcam footage, note the timestamp, check the mirrors twice more, before pulling back onto the road. Elena sat wrapped in a blanket someone had offered from a nearby car, watching him work through the aftermath with the same unhurried focus he brought to everything, and felt, for the first time since she'd met him, something closer to gratitude than suspicion. The incident detonated through the company by morning. Board members demanded answers. Richard Kane, standing before an emergency session with practiced concern on his face, suggested gently, reasonably, the way a man plants a seed he wants to see grow, that perhaps the driver himself bore some responsibility, that his background hadn't been vetted as thoroughly as it should have been, that it was worth asking whether Marcus Reed had any connection to what had nearly happened. It was a suggestion built entirely on nothing, and it was exactly the kind of suggestion that spreads fastest in a room already afraid. In the chaos of that morning, while executives argued in a glass conference room 2 floors above him, Marcus sat in his car outside the building, phone pressed to his ear, voice dropping into something softer than anyone at Voss Dynamics had ever heard from him. Sophie's voice came through small and frightened. "Dad, are you okay?" They said something happened. He told her he was fine, that nothing had touched him, that he would be home in time for dinner like always. She asked if he was sure, in the way children do when they already sense their parent is softening the truth, and he promised her twice, gently, until her voice steadied. It was a 40-second call that revealed, to no one but the empty parking lot around him, that the silent, unreadable driver had an entire life waiting for him. Beyond these walls, a life no one at the company had ever thought to ask about. Elena spent that night reviewing the highway camera footage herself, ignoring Kane's advice to let the board's internal review handle it. She sat alone in her office, long after the building had emptied, replaying the same 12 seconds over and over. Frame by frame, she watched the truck drift, watched Marcus's hands move with a control that bordered on inhuman, watched him place himself in the vehicle exactly where the danger couldn't reach them. There was no hesitation in the footage. There was no panic. There was only method. By the time she reached the end of the recording, her understanding of the man had shifted in a way she wasn't ready to admit out loud, even to herself. She overruled the board the next morning, informing them flatly that Marcus Reed would remain employed, that the footage cleared him of any wrongdoing, and that the conversation was closed. Kane pushed back harder than she expected, his usual measured tone slipping into something closer to desperation, as he argued that her judgment was being clouded, that this decision could cost her the confidence of the very board members whose support she needed for the contract vote. Elena held her ground, though she couldn't yet explain, even to herself, Why protecting this particular employee mattered as much as it suddenly did. She simply knew, with a certainty she didn't examine too closely, that she was not going to let this man be sacrificed for a story that didn't hold together. Later that week, while reviewing employee files for an unrelated audit, she noticed something strange in Marcus's personnel folder, a torn corner on one page, as though a portion of his employment history had been removed, and the page hastily returned to the file. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have meant anything, but paired with everything else, it settled into her chest as one more question she couldn't set down, one more thread in a pattern she was only beginning to see the shape of. She thought, briefly, about asking human resources who had last pulled the file, then decided against it. Something told her the answer wouldn't be simple, and some part of her, the part that had spent years learning to read a room before speaking, sensed that whatever was hidden in that folder connected to something larger than a clerical error. She closed the file, locked it back in the cabinet, and told herself she would return to it when she had time, though the thought stayed with her far longer than she expected it to. The accident had left the car's interior scattered, papers and a spare jacket thrown from the back seat during the sharp maneuver that saved them both. Elena, helping gather the mess the following afternoon, out of something that felt more like guilt than obligation, lifted the old jacket from the floor and felt something solid shift inside an inner pocket. She hadn't meant to look, but the fabric had come loose, and the object slid partway free before she could stop it. A metal, heavier than it looked, engraved with a unit designation she recognized immediately, because her own father, decades earlier, before he'd built Voss Dynamics into what it was, had spent years working in defense and security circles where that same designation was spoken of only in careful, hushed terms. She stood frozen in the garage, the metal resting in her palm, understanding arriving in fragments faster than she could organize them. When she turned to find Marcus watching her from a few feet away, his expression didn't carry embarrassment or alarm. It carried the tired patience of a man who had known this moment would eventually come. She asked him directly what it meant, what he had done, why he had never said a word. He didn't deny what she was holding. He confirmed quietly that the unit was real, that the metal was his, that the operation attached to it was the reason he no longer worked in that world at all. But when she pressed for more, for names, for details, for the story behind the man who had just saved her life on a Charlotte highway without breaking a sweat, he simply shook his head. "Some things are better left alone," he said, and there was nothing cold in the way he said it, only the weight of someone who had already carried it long enough for both of them. For a moment, standing there in the half-lit garage, neither of them said anything else. The silence between them felt different than before, not the silence of a driver and his employer, but something closer to two people quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew. It should have ended there, but Elena, unable to let the thread go, spent the following night cross-referencing the unit designation against declassified operation summaries her father had once mentioned in passing, summaries connected, impossibly, to the very security architecture Voss Dynamics had spent 3 years developing for the contract now hanging in the balance. It wasn't coincidence. It was history repeating itself in a shape she hadn't expected, a strange and deliberate thread connecting the man behind her steering wheel to the technology her company had built to protect people exactly like the ones he had once protected in uniform. She sat back from her desk near midnight, the pieces finally arranging themselves into something she could almost see whole, and understood, with a chill she couldn't quite name, that Marcus Reed had walked into her company carrying far more than she had ever bothered to ask about. She thought back over every interaction since his first day, the way he'd absorbed her worst moment in that hotel lobby without a flicker of resentment, the way he'd handled the highway with a calm that belonged to someone who had faced far worse than traffic, in the way he spoke about his daughter with a softness that seemed to belong to an entirely different man than the one who had once carried that metal into whatever operation had earned it. Two versions of him existed side by side, and she found herself wanting, more than she was willing to admit, to understand how both could be true of the same quiet, careful man. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced of her father, years earlier, mentioning a name over dinner, a unit that had once quietly resolved a situation the news never reported, men whose service went unrecognized by design rather than oversight. She had been a teenager then, half listening, more interested in her own life than her father's old stories. Now, sitting alone with the weight of what she'd just learned, she wished she had listened more closely, wished she had asked the questions that might have prepared her for exactly this moment. Richard Kane felt the walls closing in before he understood exactly how or why, and men like Kane, when cornered, rarely choose silence. He called an emergency session of the full board, insisting the matter could not wait another day, and stood before them with a folder of carefully selected half-truths, painting Marcus Reed as an infiltrator, a man with a scrubbed record and a convenient history of appearing exactly where danger threatened the company, a man who might not have prevented the highway incident at all, but orchestrated it to earn Elena's trust. He demanded security be called immediately, that Marcus be detained before he could do further damage. His voice rose with every sentence, and the more he spoke, the more he seemed to convince himself that volume alone might substitute for evidence. The boardroom turned as one to look at Marcus, who had been summoned to answer for himself, standing at the head of the long table in the same quiet stillness that had first drawn attention to him weeks earlier. Suspicion moved through the room like a current, board members exchanging glances, murmurs rising, the accusation taking root in real time before anyone had proven a single word of it. Elena sat at the far end of the table, caught between the mounting hysteria around her and the memory of steady hands on a steering wheel that had never once faltered. She watched the room turn against a man she had spent weeks quietly beginning to trust, and felt something in her chest tighten at how easily an entire company could be convinced of a lie simply because it was told loudly enough. One of the older board members, a man who had sat across from Elena's father for 2 decades, leaned toward Kane and asked, quietly but not quietly enough, whether there was any actual proof beyond suspicion. Kane brushed the question aside, insisting that time was the one thing they didn't have, that waiting for proof while a potential threat sat in their own boardroom was exactly the kind of hesitation that could sink the company. It was a persuasive argument, built entirely on urgency instead of fact, and for a moment, it seemed to be working. A few board members nodded along, unwilling to be the one who hesitated if Kane turned out to be right. Marcus said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, retrieved a small drive, and set it on the polished table without a word, sliding it toward the nearest laptop. The room fell silent, not because anyone demanded it, but because something in his composure made noise feel inappropriate. "I have protected people far more important than everyone in this room combined," he said, his voice low and even, carrying to every corner without needing volume. "I don't need any of you to believe who I am. I only need you to look at the truth." The screen came alive with data Marcus had quietly gathered over the previous weeks, ever since the pattern of Kane's behavior had first registered as wrong recorded calls, encrypted transfers, timestamps that lined up precisely with confidential bid details leaking to a rival firm overseas, and buried within the files, unmistakable evidence that the same truck driver involved in the highway incident had received a payment traced back through 3 shell accounts to Kane himself. It was methodical, exhaustive, exactly the kind of surveillance a man trained to notice threats, before they materialized, would compile without anyone ever suspecting he was watching. Line by line, the board watched weeks of careful documentation unfold across the screen, each piece slotting into the last until the shape of the conspiracy became impossible to deny. A secure video call, arranged through channels Marcus still quietly maintained, connected moments later to a retired general who confirmed, in clipped and unmistakable language, exactly who Marcus Reed had been before he ever set foot in that boardroom, a former commander of a specialized unit, once consulted directly by federal agencies on security matters, precisely like the one now unraveling in front of them. The general spoke for less than a minute, but every word landed like a verdict, and by the time the call ended, there wasn't a single person left in that room who doubted what they had just heard. Elena listened to every word without moving, watching the man she had once threatened to fire in a hotel lobby stand quietly at the head of the table, while a retired general spoke about him with a respect she had rarely heard directed at anyone. She thought about the torn page in his personnel file, about the metal in the old jacket, about the gray sedan that had disappeared so cleanly weeks earlier, and understood, finally, that every strange detail she had noticed along the way had been part of the same picture, all along a picture she simply hadn't had enough information to see clearly until now. The transformation in the room was immediate. Suspicion evaporated. Kane's face drained of color as security, summoned not for Marcus but for him, entered through the double doors. He tried, briefly, to protest, to reframe what everyone had just seen, but his voice had lost the authority it once carried, and no one in the room was listening anymore. The board member who had questioned him earlier now looked at Kane with open contempt, shaking his head slowly, the same silent judgment moving around the table from one face to the next. Years of trust unraveled in the space of a few minutes, replaced by the particular kind of quiet that follows when a room realizes it had been managed rather than informed. Elena watched it happen without satisfaction. Only a tired kind of clarity, understanding now how long this had been allowed to continue, simply because no one had thought to look closely enough. Before he was let out, Kane turned back one last time, shouting across the room that this wasn't the only scheme buried inside the company, that someone else remained untouched, unnamed, still walking these halls, a final, unresolved thread the doors closed on before he could say another word. The room sat in stunned silence, long after he was gone, the weight of what had almost happened settling slowly over everyone still seated at the table. The days after carried a different weight through the halls of Voss Dynamics. Elena called a company-wide meeting, and in front of the same executives who had once watched a security guard tear through Marcus's trunk without objection, she apologized to him directly, publicly, without hedging. She told the room, plainly, that she had let assumptions guide her judgment when she should have looked closer, and that the company owed Marcus Reed more than an apology. It owed him recognition for exactly what he had done, quietly and without asking for credit, to protect people who had barely bothered to learn his name. She offered him the position of Director of Security, compensation and authority that reflected exactly what he had proven himself capable of, not what a staffing agency had once assumed about a quiet man in an old jacket. The offer was generous, the kind of opportunity that would have once felt unreachable, and for a moment, the entire room waited to see what he would say. A ripple of applause moved through the room, quiet at first, then steadier, executives who had once looked past him now looking directly at him with something closer to respect than curiosity. The young security guard who had torn through his trunk weeks earlier stood near the back of the room, unable to meet his eyes, understanding now exactly how wrong that first impression had been. Marcus accepted none of it as vindication. He simply nodded once, the same economy of motion he brought to everything, unwilling to let a single moment of recognition undo years of learning to stay quiet, and let his work speak instead. Marcus hesitated before answering, not from doubt in Elena, but from the familiar pull of a promise he'd made to himself 2 years earlier, that nothing, no title, no salary, would ever again come before Sophie's bedtime. Her school mornings, the small, steady rhythm they had built together out of grief. He thought of the mornings in the kitchen, the worksheets at the table, the drive to school with the same 3 songs on low, and weighed all of it silently against the offer in front of him. Elena, watching him weigh it, told him gently that the role came with the flexibility he needed, that she understood now, more than she ever had before, what it meant to protect the people who mattered most, and that she had no intention of asking him to trade one for the other. In the weeks that followed, the company began to settle into a version of itself that felt steadier than it had in years. The government contract moved forward without the shadow of Kane's leaks hanging over it. The board grew quieter and more deliberate in its decisions, and Elena found herself trusting her own judgment in ways she hadn't allowed herself to before. She still worked long hours, still carried the weight of a company built on her father's legacy, but something in the way she carried it had changed, softened at the edges by everything the past month had taught her about the difference between loyalty and control. Weeks later, she found herself at his front door on a quiet Saturday afternoon, invited for something as simple as coffee, something that had grown naturally out of everything they'd survived together. The house was smaller than anything she was used to, but it carried a warmth she hadn't expected, the kind that came from years of 2 people learning to hold each other up. Inside, Sophie sat at the kitchen table with a box of colored pencils, deeply focused on a drawing she refused to explain, tongue between her teeth in concentration. When Elena finally leaned over to look, she found a picture of 3 figures standing together outside a small house. Marcus, Sophie, and a third figure Sophie hadn't quite finished coloring in yet. Neither adult said a word about it. Marcus poured the coffee, the same unhurried motion he brought to everything he did, and set 2 mugs on the table. Elena sat down across from Sophie, asking her gently about the drawing, about school, about nothing in particular, while outside the window the afternoon light settled soft and golden over the quiet street, and for the first time in longer than either adult could remember, neither of them felt the need to be anywhere else. The house stayed quiet in the way houses do when nothing needs fixing, when no one is bracing for the next hard thing to arrive. Sophie eventually held up her drawing, satisfied enough to show it after all, though she still wouldn't explain who the third figure was meant to be, only smiling in the private, knowing way children sometimes do when they understand something the adults around them haven't caught up to yet. Marcus caught Elena's eye across the table for a moment longer than either of them probably intended, and neither looked away first. Neither of them had been looking,